So here we go. So welcome everyone, for the people online too, welcome. It's such a pleasure to return, give a lecture live after this 2 years time waiting for this. So my name is Vicente de Moura. I am training analyst here at the Jung Institute and supervisor. And I'm going to present to you the shadow as inner critic and aggressor. The basic idea is to show you a particularly constellation of the shadow, which usually is described about the shadow as it's projected upon someone. I have made some readings about the topic in different literature, and then I find out that there is a particular constellation which we'll trying to present in the Jung view today, where the shadow, instead of being projected, turns against oneself. And this constellation requires a particular element, and this is what I'm trying to present to you today. For the people online who are listening to this lecture now, I just would like to say that this lecture will be put on my website, and for privacy reasons, the people who are online will not be shown, their faces will not be shown. Your comments can be here, but your faces will not be shown, just by security and privacy reasons, okay? So, brilliant. Let's start. Yep. Here we go. This is what we are going to approach today, the content of the lecture. So the first, the Socratic metaphor. What Socrates talks about inner voices. And then the demons in the Middle Ages. So what we know about the demons, I'll not go deep on this stuff, but I think it's a very interesting way to see how inner voices change concerning their value during the time. So, and then the psychoanalytic model, that's interesting because they work a lot with the theta introject, so the aggressor introjected. And we're going to see that from this psychoanalytical view, we can learn a lot also for the Jungian perspective. And then we are going to approach Jung. What Jung talks about the shadow, and also shadow, ego, projection, and introjection. In this presentation, these kind of mechanisms and structures of the psyche are key concepts that we need to go into in order to grasp what is meant. And then the emergence of the shadow as an inner critic and aggressor, how it comes up, how it develops usually. And I'm not talking about a normal inner critic, I'm talking about a real severe inner critic that is really a burden for those who have this kind of constellation. And at the end, I would like to tell you a little bit what can be done. So how we as therapists, as analysts, may try help people under this kind of constellation. So I came to these ideas when I was reading this book in German, where they talked about innere Kritiker, Verfolger und Zerstörer. So the inner critic as persecutor and destroyer. He presents a work with imagination and a psychoanalytical view. And as I read that, I said, wait a minute. I think that Jungian perspective can add something to that. And then I developed a little kind of train of thoughts in order to see how Jung would understand, or better to say, how Jungian perspectives can be used this, how would be the difference from the psychoanalytical view, and what can we work, what can be done about these things. So, beginning with the Socratic metaphor, Socrates wrote the following, that daimonion was regarded by him as an inner voice of divine origin. So a voice that comes from the gods, okay? Here you have Socrates with the whispering inner voice telling him, and this is understanding, because for him it was an instancy contrary to the logos, was not something coming from rational thought, which recognized what was hidden from reason and advised against what was wrong, but did not persuade one to do anything. That's very interesting. It was some kind of other view, supportive many times, counseling-like, and was a pretty much powerful thing that he trusts more his daimonion than his reason. That's a very interesting thing about Socrates. So In the Middle Ages, this idea of the demon changed completely. Here we have a saint in the Middle Ages, pictured in this, being tormented by, and this is the demons in the Middle Ages were evil spirits sent by Satan. And they led to fall into temptations, tormented, or led to irrational behavior. So there was tormenting inner voices. The demon has a completely transformed value that it had for Socrates in the same trend of inner voices. But we all know this. We all have inner voices. We all have these elements in us that sometimes, well, it's friendly voice that comfort us. Sometimes, as mentor or advisor, we know that. This inner dialogue with our own psyche. Pretty much interesting kind of talk we can have with ourselves without being schizophrenic, by the way. But sometimes also as a severe, judicious, and even humiliating voice. This is the focus that we're going to give. This kind of inner voice that is not just advising or reprehending us, that is really attacking us. This requires, in this kind of constellation, a specific kind of, let's say, life experience, a specific kind of development that somehow developed in a very bad way. So let's talk a little bit about the psychoanalytic model from Freud. In 1923, he wrote The Ego and the Id, das Ich und Es. And he wrote on this book about the model of this level inside the psyche. He called the id, can just desire. This is basically the definition of id, of es in German, for Freud. And then the ego, the poor servant of two lords, of two masters. So the ego must find a way between what is my desires coming from the unconscious and the things coming from the superego. This is an element that's very important in this constellation that we are talking about. Basically, the Freudian way to develop the psyche would be, es ist, soll ich werden. So where there is the id should become an ego. This is a pretty much Freudian saying how we should develop the psyche. We must transform our desire, our unconscious, unfulfilled, prohibited, or whatever kind of desire I have, into a kind of ego stuff. I must become conscious of it, transforming this desire, sublimating sometimes in something that is conscious, that I'm conscious about. So this is a pretty much saying in Freudian view that says how to develop the psyche, basically. But we also have something that comes into us from outside. And this element or this model, in this model, Freud describes the superego. He proposes the existence of the superego to refer to that instance of the psyche in which resides the experience social norms, the learned values that should be obeyed, and moral conscience. Basically, the concept of superego. We learn from childhood what we should not, according to the values of the society we are living in. So this kind of values, the way we relate to our parents or important people who are responsible to us when we are little, this kind of values we learn through our lives. Sometimes we fight against, sometimes we accept as a normal that we should be respected, and so on and so forth. And this is put inside the psyche through a process of internalization. I bring it in, it becomes internal. What was outside, coming from parents, as I said, teachers, and so on, becomes something in me, an internalized element of the psyche. Okay? By the way, if in any moment you would like to make a question, feel free to do so. Okay, you're really welcome, because I think sometimes when we do not understand clear something, just raise your hand and we go, yes, that's brilliant. So here we go.
By internalization in Jungian technology, it's going into the personal unconscious, or going into the ego, or both, or
what we do with what is internalized, it depends of the personality, depends of the value, depends of many things. You can usually take it consciously, then in the direction you said, your ego will be internalizing the things. You are doing, by the way, right now. When you ask the question, you are taking, let's say, part of your knowledge, comparing with what I'm saying, and trying to figure out how it combines. You are using your ego to internalize a concept. It's by far not something emotional or like a complex, heavily burdened with emotions, but by the way, it's just now a rational thing. But sometimes I can just act in a certain way, and then you got, not consciously, but your psyche in an unconscious way can absorb it. I have an example for a teacher that I had many years ago, and she told me that she was going with her 12-year-old daughter to buy her first BH, how say it, BH? Bra, the first bra of this young lady. And she was completely happy with the daughter. And she, you can choose whatever you want, she said to her daughter. And the daughter was walking around and look, a very beautiful red one. And as the daughter took in her hands, the mother said, but red. She didn't say it's bad or not, but alone the expression showed to this young girl, there was maybe something wrong in that color. Maybe it was something wrong for the daughter, for the mother. You see, in that kind of communication, maybe the daughter didn't realize that there was a message, but there was a value. And maybe her conscious of the daughter did not grasp it, but for sure her emotions got it. And this is the kind of communication that goes to the unconscious and could be internalized. So far, so good?
Very clear.
Brilliant. So, in order to understand what we are talking about, we need to go through concepts. And I'm going to present to you concepts of introjection and projection in psychoanalysis. We're going to see later what Jung talked about these terms, but I think it's important to have these different perspectives because they worked a lot on this kind of defense mechanisms. So, introjection, it acts as a very early and fundamental level of organization of internalization processes. It serves as a mechanism for the growth of the psyche apparatus, for the formation of the ego and superego structures. So you bring it in, exactly the way I'm presenting to you with this example I mentioned. And as early defense mechanism of the ego, that's pretty much important, especially against overwhelming fear and loss, particularly in small children. I think that we all play pick and boo with small kids. Oh, hello, 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 hello. And you hide before, and the kids feel fascinating. There is this theory that says that the kid does not have a permanent notion that what is there in front of me will come again. So for the kid, it's somehow like disappearing, it's out of the view, it's not there. And when there is a link, a bond, this connection with the mother, this deep emotional connection with the mother, with the father, and so on, and it disappeared, it becomes a sense of loss, a sense of anxiety. The child cries when the mother, many times, when the mother goes away. And what happens then is that there is an internalized image of this protecting figure, and it calms fear of loss. Because now the child realizes there is something in me, an image, a feeling that says it will be back. This is an internalization of the mother, and it works as a protective thing. I have something in me that can stay with me while my mother is away. We are talking about small children. So far, so good? Brilliant. Projection. The perception of an external object is remodeled in the psyche so that the representation of the object appears as the person project expects it to be. It's unconsciously. So I put something from me on other people. But it's an unconscious movement. Basically, this mechanism is what is responsible later with many misunderstandings, with many conflicts. I do not digest things in me. I have troubles in accepting, for instance, my aggressiveness or my giddy, my ambitious, whatever. And then I see this in the other. Jung said the shadow is projected because of that. I do not accept things in me, or I repress things in me, or the things in me that are not compatible with my own values. So what I see is outside. Here we talk a little bit about collective shadow too, and projection in a collective sense. Usually we have this into extremes in social movements too. We have seen in history many different examples of that. So these two terms are more or less easy to understand. There is a third term, a third mechanism that I think is pretty much important to understand. That is called the projective identification. Usually when I present this, people say, what? What does it mean? So projected identification, the tendency to get the other person to behave as I expected him or her to behave. The projector strives to find in the other or induce the other to become the very embodiment of the projection. It's a circular confirmation of my unconscious assumption. Well, I will show you a small video from the German-speaking people here. It's a very known video. It's a joke-like video, but I think that it shows so perfectly what is a projective identification and how it works, that I think for people who doesn't know the video will get it, really will grasp this concept pretty much easy. You're gonna have, it's in German, but you have undertitles in English down, and Portuguese, my mother tongue, up. So in order to have it, let's see it. It's about 3 minutes. Here we go.
Ja?
Was machst du da?
Nichts.
Nichts? Wieso nichts?
Ich mache nichts.
Gar nichts?
Nein.
Überhaupt nichts?
Nein, ich sitze hier.
Du sitzt da?
Ja.
Aber irgendwas machst du doch.
Nein.
Denkst du irgendwas?
Nichts Besonderes.
Es könnte ja nicht schaden, wenn du mal etwas spazieren gingest.
Nein, nein.
Ich bringe dir deinen Mantel.
Nein, danke.
Aber es ist zu kalt ohne Mantel.
Ich gehe ja nicht spazieren.
Aber eben wolltest du doch noch.
Nein, du wolltest, dass ich spazieren gehe.
Ich? Mir ist es doch völlig egal, ob du spazieren gehst.
Gut.
Ich meine nur, es könnte dir nicht schaden, wenn du mal spazieren gehen würdest.
Nein, schaden könnte es nicht.
Also was willst du denn nun?
Ich möchte hier sitzen.
Du kannst einen ja wahnsinnig machen.
Ach,
Erst willst du spazieren gehen, dann wieder nicht. Dann soll ich deinen Mantel holen, dann wieder nicht. Was denn nun?
ich möchte hier sitzen.
Jetzt möchtest du plötzlich da sitzen.
Gar nicht plötzlich. Ich wollte immer nur hier sitzen.
Sitzen?
Ich möchte hier sitzen und mich entspannen.
Wenn du dich wirklich entspannen wolltest, würdest du nicht dauernd auf mich einreden.
Ich sag ja nichts mehr.
Jetzt hättest du doch mal Zeit, irgendwas zu tun, was dir Spaß macht.
Ja,
Liest du was?
im Moment nicht.
Dann lies doch mal was.
Nachher vielleicht.
Hol dir doch die Illustrierten.
Ich möchte erst noch etwas hier sitzen.
Soll ich sie dir holen?
Nein, vielen Dank.
Will der Herr sich auch noch mit die liegen lassen, was? Ich renne den ganzen Tag hin und her. Du könntest wohl einmal aufstehen und dir die Illustrierten holen.
Ich möchte jetzt nicht lesen.
Mal möchtest du lesen, mal nicht.
Ich möchte einfach hier sitzen.
Du kannst doch tun, was dir Spaß macht.
Das tue ich ja.
Dann quäl doch nicht dauernd so rum. Hermann? Bist du taub?
Nein, nein.
Du tust eben nicht, was dir Spaß macht. Stattdessen sitzt du da.
Ich sitze hier, weil es mir Spaß macht.
Sei doch nicht gleich so aggressiv.
Ich bin doch nicht aggressiv.
Warum schreist du mich dann so an?
Ich schreie dich nicht an.
Und wenn wir die Frau in der Therapie haben, oh, sorry. Excuse me. And if we have this woman on therapy, she would say, my husband is so aggressive. He's yelling at me all the time, and it can really be happening. But sometimes it's very important to have this in mind. The projective identification is the circular confirmation of my expectations onto the other. I, with my behavior, lead the other to behave in a way that I expect him to be done. And it works badly, terribly effective. So, why is that important? Because it happens all the time. Okay? So, further, I always must be careful with the time. So, frontiers on trauma treatment, we have the term introjected aggressor. And what we have on this term is the following. An introject, according to Freud's postulation, exists only when the occupation of the object is eliminated, that is, in the case of an unproceed loss. I didn't work, for instance, when I lost an important person of my life, and I bring it in, like the child to protect, I get something in me in order to keep that part of this emotional value inside. But according to this author, but also I would add, in the case of a traumatic impact caused by the object, resulting in the abandonment of the relationship to which it would be intolerable to remain attached. When I have someone who is part of my family or for my ambience, and the relationship is so bad, I give up the relationship. And part of this loss, I'm afraid of losing this person because I have feelings attached to this person too, get into me. I bring some part of this person in me. If there is something really bad happening with someone that's important, it comes into me. Jung will add something to this view too, but this is still only the psychoanalytic view. That is, the relationship with the external object is abandoned and is replaced in the internal place by the introject, which becomes part of the inner world. So far, so good? Oh, sorry.
That's not only with parents or figures that are part of our lives regardless. It can be partner, like husband.
Yes, it could happen too. If it is a traumatic event, and this is the addiction that Hirsch observes. Okay? Yes?
So the husband in the video, he should leave the room, right? He should, right?
Could be.
I work a lot with court-ordered people who have angry outbursts because they're in this exact situation with a guy. And when I'm teaching them boundaries, it starts with you must leave the stimulus of your anger.
Yep.
And then you will see from there whether there's a potential for the relationship to continue or not, depending on how the other person responds.
I see. That makes sense.
Okay.
You see, we all need to have some strategies. What I'm going to point here is that what this person hits in me too, not only what comes from outside, because also Hermann has an aggressive side. Maybe he was calm at that moment. The other triggers or activates in me, in Jungian terms, constellates in me also a complex. If Herman had, for instance, a passive father or mother figure who accepts everything, this could be like Adolf Guggenbusch says, marriage is the coming together of two neuroses. It's a pretty much to the point remark. Sometimes when it comes together, too passive attitude with a too aggressive outside, they fit into each other and they build up a kind of collusion. If I identify in myself my own complexes, what, let's say, helps this constellation to be kept in the relationship, it transforms my attitude. Becoming conscious of our own complexes lead us to transform the things outside. I worked with, many years ago, not any longer, but I worked with couple, not couple therapy, but counseling a little bit, based on these two different cultures, so Swiss and Brazilian as myself or other cultures. And I usually tell them, okay, you cannot change your partner, but if you change yourself, your partner will be forced to change, or the relationship has no chance. So it's okay? Brilliant. Here we go. Oops, wrong button. In this way, the external aggressor becomes part of the inner world, and now the internal object repeats its message. That's the point. When something is introjected, this inner voice is a kind of repetition of this external voice, but now it's part of me. Bang. That's the biggest issue here. And all this is about the psychoanalytical view of this phenomenon. We're a child, and now we are talking about development, okay? When a child is repeatedly exposed to intimidating, overwhelming, painful situations, including sexualized ones, either with their own parents or caregivers, then the identification with the aggressor's hatred is inevitable. You see, that's the point. When a small child is relating to someone who is putting hate on the behavior, it will get in the child. Because, you see, the child will do so because the aggressor in the situation where violence occurs represents the notion of power, control, and strength, and is in a superior position to the victim. This is especially true for a child who is too young to have internalized any moral concepts of interpersonal violence. This is all from this book that I mentioned, and the translation is mine, okay? So what is meant here is the following. A small child does not have the cognition, the emotional development enough to separate, but you are the bad guy here. He will not, or she will not understand what's going on. She was just taking it in. And there we have an internalized aggressor. In a Jungian sense, what we're going to see later is that it becomes part of the shadow. But we're going to see this later. So far, so good?
Even if the child consciously knows that what the parent is doing is wrong?
It depends on many elements. It could happen too. We have seen many times, because you see, it's not just a knowing thing. It's not a rational thing. By the way, to work with that, it's not enough to stay only by reason. We must go to transform any complex. We must go into emotions. Otherwise, it's an extremely nice theory who brings you and your client nowhere. It's just a logical thing. Insight is pretty much important. But in order to transform whatever behavior, whatever idea, whatever imaginary thing in me, I need to have it connected with a different emotion. So far, so good?
Yeah, with children is a problem because if the child knows that the parents do, but how can a child even know that the parents doing something wrong if that's all they know? So because I saw other parents treating their children differently.
You see, it's a very individual thing, but you're right. The child doesn't have the cognition, the emotional development in a way that he can deal with it. And that's the biggest thing. That's the trouble having child exposed to this kind of behavior.
I remember I was reading something for incest, and it said that the victim didn't even know it was coming from the father. So that's a figure that you look up towards, you know, so you don't know that what he's doing is wrong, so you go with it because
there is this sense it should not be happening, but the child doesn't even know what should not be happening, why it's happening. And that's the trigger. It mixed with the own developmental stuff inside the child, the ego, the shadow, in Freudian terms, the superego, and so on and so forth.
And it gets internalized back on the child. It must be me. It's my fault.
Here you see the bigger problem we are dealing with.
Yeah, but even if you know, you see that those other parents are acting a particular way, that I must be doing something wrong with my parents.
And in Piaget's development stuff, you see also the egocentric element, not egoistic, the egocentric element of the child. Everything that happens outside has something to do with me. And if I'm treating badly, I must have done something wrong. We need to move on because I'm really scared about the time. I always have troubles with my presentations. I want to talk too much. So here we go. Let's jump into Jung. Okay? Okay. Until now, what we presented was the psychoanalytic ideas of this kind of constellation, of this kind of complex formation. Okay? What we're going to see now is how Jung add to this view a particular way even to work with later. Okay? So, Jung postulated the existence of complex that act upon the ego. We all have complex, or as Jung would say, the complex have all of us. So we cannot be free of complex. So the complex are the honors of our psyche, so to say. Complexes are basically psychic structures resulting from the way our experiences, emotions, and our ideas are connected. The simplest way to explain a complex is an idea with an emotion, period. Mother complex. The ideas that I think and learn from mother and my emotions related to it. It could be good, could be bad, could be mixed, whatever. So an idea with an emotion. This is the basically definition of a complex. Money complex, inferiority complex, and all this complex goes in the same line. So these structures have as their base typical interior disposition, which functions as organizers of the psychic event. That's what Jung calls the archetypes. So there is some potential in us as a potential, which depending of what I live, what I see, how I experience, how I digest, this structure will be filled with our personal elements. And then we have a constellation. The basis itself I cannot see, but once it's put some of my personal stuff in it, it becomes activated in my own psyche in a particular way. So further with Jung's theory, these structures influence us through our lives and as the personality develops. This is what Jung calls the individuation process. We have this structure, and through life, the things that I encounter, depending on phases of life, these will be developed. And as Jung said, there is a goal in it, the integration of these elements in my psyche. Later, he called this the individuation process. Later, I mean in Jung's experience after 1914. Good. The main structures that Jung postulates in this process are the ego. I like a sentence of one of my former analysts, and he was a great guy, Ian Baker. He said, psychosis is an individuation process without the ego. And I think he also hit the mark. Without the ego, we do not exist. I have seen many times Jung talk about the importance of the self, and no doubt how important the self is about. But without the ego, what happens? We cannot live it. We do not know what it's about. So the ego is a main and extremely important structure of the psyche. Okay? Then the shadow. We're going to see some definitions Jung gave to the shadow later. And then anima, animus. Okay? don't need to talk much about it. This other counter-sex element in my own psyche, how I relate outside with women or men, and so on and so forth. And the self, the totality of the psyche in one definition, the center of the psyche in a second one. Jung defined in a dual way. There can be both. As a center of the psyche, it's close to the image of God. As the totality of the psyche, we are talking about the totality of the personality, the conscious and the unconscious one. So far, so good. Very short, the main elements in Jung's theory. So, how it looks like when we see these concepts in a model. And remember that the land is not the map of the land. Okay? There's a big difference. What's this here? What you have is a possibility to visualize these elements, how they connect to each other. So far, so good? Here we go. Remember, or consider the psyche as a sphere. We're going to have this sphere in two parts. One that related to the external world. You are using right now, watching this material, and the inner world, that is what's going on inside of you, that just you have access and is trying to understand with your knowledge, with your values, with your experiences, what is being presenting. Happens inside of you. The center of the psyche is the ego. Sorry, the center of the conscious part of the psyche is the ego. And between my ego and the external world, in Jung's presentation, I'm going to have my persona. You see? Blazer, PhD, training analyst. Wow. You see, this kind of stuff is part of my persona. This is part of me, but it's not my personality. We all have that. We all have our persona, what we show outside. Persona from the Greek word of the mask that the actor used in the play in the ancient Greek theater. So, but we also have the ego, parts that are not conscious. We have parts of the ego that belongs to our personal unconscious because we don't have it in my conscious right now. Sometimes I can reach this part of my psyche if I have some kind of concentration, of confrontation. And it depends on my attention, of my ability to deal with that, and so on. I can give you an example. I need a volunteer. Maybe you can be my volunteer. So brilliant. No, stay there, stay there. Can you please describe? You have one of your feet on one of your foot on the ground, right? Brilliant. Can you describe how you feel your foot right now?
How do I feel my foot?
Yeah. It's warm or cold?
Warm.
Warm.
Yeah.
It's comfortable?
Yes.
Brilliant. Your shoe is okay, or it's too tight, or it's too big? How it looks like? Brilliant.
It's perfect.
Is anything that is disturbing you on this foot? On the floor?
I just feel the connection with the ground.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I can imagine that your foot was there before my question. That's also brilliant. But once I asked you, you concentrate your attention to what was going on your foot. That's correct. That's the way unconscious and conscious mind works. We have a huge amount of stimulus, a huge amount of perceptions. This was a sense perception of his foot. And once I drive my attention, part of my will, and with that, the libido, the psychic energy that's available to my ego to explore the things in me, he, through my questions, led this libido, this attention, to flow to his perception. And through that, he got impressions from what was before outside his consciousness. So far, so good. This is the way psyche works. And we could do that with many different elements, including not so quote unquote easy ones, like the sensations of, thank you, his foot. So, Jung postulated further that there is a realm in our psyche, a layer in our psyche, that is the collective unconscious. And these are not visible in itself, just its manifestations. Here we have the so-called, again, a postulation of Jung, the archetypes. And among the archetypes, we have the shadow. We can be aware part of the shadow, but biggest part, probably not. The animus and anima, another part. This is what we talked before. We can see the center of the personality as the self, as the center of the personality who regulates all these elements inside, and the totality of the personality. This is also another definition for self. This is how Jung described the model, or possible way to describe the model of the psyche according to Jung. Okay? So far, so good. Let's jump a little bit then in what Jung describes as shadow. By shadow, I mean the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, together with the insufficiently developed functions and the contents of the personal unconscious. If you want to find out where I check these quotes, you have here collected works, paragraph in the footnote. I try to pick up some definitions that are somehow easy to understand in one way, in the other way, that are related to the topics we are dealing right now. Okay? So, the things that I don't like it, the things that I repress, the things that are against my values, they jump down in the shadow. Okay? Further, the personal unconscious contains lost memories, painful ideas. They are repressed, that means forgotten on purpose. Subliminal perceptions, by which are meant sense perceptions that are not strong enough to reach consciousness. Welcome to your food. Okay? This is the kind of things that are there. And finally, contents that are not yet ripe for consciousness. It corresponds to the figure of the shadow, so frequently met with in dreams. When I met something in dream that I do not understand, I don't like it. Doesn't mean necessarily it's my shadow, but it's a pretty much good question. What is that element that represents this figure in the dream? What has this element to do with me? So far, so good. So, we have here the shadow and the ego, and this is an interesting relationship. We see that we have personal experiences, we have our education, we have feelings that we realize, we have the impulses inside, we have our ideas, and we build up with that through the years our identity. The negative psychic elements, not integrate, not compatible, goes into the unconscious, and there it activates and is summoned up in my shadow. So far, so good. Lost memories, repressed and embarrassing ideas, subliminal perceptions, contents that are not yet mature enough to become conscious. This will be the main content of this shadow.
Is any of this even our own material, like embarrassing ideas, repressed things, that all comes from the outside? Like,
not necessarily. Sometimes we came to conclusions that we don't like it, and I say, I don't want to think about it.
Yeah, but why don't we like it? Because
values, experiences, education, what?
In us at the beginning when we were growing up.
This is partially true, but not only that. Sometimes we developed with our experiences. You see, most of them we can concerning values we got from outside, but we also with time, with teenager time, we start to check, is that to me okay or not? Do I accept it or not? And then this questioning, I can come to conclusion that I don't like this conclusion that I got, or this feeling that I have. And then sometimes we just push it down. It can come from outside, it can also come from inside. The inner world as big as the outer world. We are relating with both.
Would it be right to say it's values and choices?
I would add that too. But we could add many more things, but this would be also an element. I choose, for instance, whatever. Because I do not know why, but sometimes we have some choices between two developments. And usually when it's that, I have pros and contras, good and bad things in one side, and the same in the other side when I need to take a decision. What I usually do, I would say what mine usually do is once I took one way, I need to repress the other. And this repressing things, as you meant choice, must be reduced because otherwise it's going to hurt me. And then a choice could be put into a shadow, repress the things that I don't like to deal. Even it's a good thing, but I need to repress them, otherwise I cannot make the choice.
Yeah, but there is no value component. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's considered right or wrong. It's just the way we choose to live our life, and that takes us in one direction. So we put back the other option.
I remember a case where a woman needs to choose between the relationship she had, a very conflictual thing in one hand, with an extremely good sexual life, and another relationship which has a very calm and pleasant everyday life with a moderate sexual pleasure. And then she had these two guys to choose on. What she did, she wanted to have a family, and she chose this guy, which was for her a good possible father. She needs to repress her sexual desire to this other guy. Otherwise, she could be standing in conflict. You see, this will be a part of the shadow, and some stupid dream would show her having sex with that guy. God, I don't like that. Put it down.
It's not necessarily negative then.
Not necessarily negative. Her pleasure was not negative at all. But the choose, she could choose, for instance, having a lover too. She could. But then come the moral values. I should not do that. I would hurt the guy that I'm with. You see, there's not black and white. That's so the difficult things about. The psyche develops in this way.
But to use that example, if she only represses it without integrating the desire, then it's just going to come out in all sorts of ways in this life with her children.
I agree with that. And the question will be what will be for her integrating. And this is always a personal thing. Some people will repress, saying, I don't want it. I don't want to see anymore. I want to keep distance. This is a way to deal with. It will have a price because repression requires energy to keep the things down. It could also develop. For instance, she could sublimate. Let's go like that. But she also could try to have a better sexual life with the partner. It's another way. You see, what will be the personal decision? This is always an individuation question.
Which way she could sublimate?
For instance, with the love for the children. I love my children so much that the sexuality becomes less important. You see, we always need to deal with emotions. And I'm not telling for someone specific that is the answer. It's a development thing. Each one of us needs to come clear with our choices and decisions. The point is how conscious I am of these decisions. How can I relate with these emotions that my decision triggers? How can I relate with that in a better way? Integrating, accepting, or simply, let's say, accepting it as part of life. Okay, I have this desire, but I decide not to leave it. That's not
energy then.
Sorry?
It frees up libido for her to put that into her children as desire.
And then you see the many different possibilities of development. And I'm pretty much careful to say do not judge, because each one of us needs to deal with that in a personal way. Yes?
So just to clarify, by using the word negative, it only means non-integrated.
It means opposed to my conscious values.
Okay. Okay.
Brilliant. Here we go. Jung on projection, and time is running. So Jung on projection and introjection, what he says. Projection means the expulsion of a subjective content into an object. It is the opposite of introjection. I put something, pull something out of my psyche, of course, unconsciously. Accordingly, it's a process of dissimulation by which a subjective content becomes alienated from the subject and is, so to speak, embodied in the object. I put this outside and something, someone becomes this part of me. Ferenczi has now defined introjection as the opposite of projection, namely as an indrawing of the object into the subjective sphere of interest, while projection is an expulsion of the subjective contents into the object. This is how Jung defines, in his way, projection and introjection. Moving further, again, Jung. Psychologically speaking, introjection is a process of, assimilation, while projection is a process of dissimulation. Yes?
So just to clarify, internalization and introjection are pretty much.
Introjection is the process, internalization is the, let's say, the whole element of it, how it's developed in a kind of structure. Let's put in this way. Introjection is required in order to have internalization. Brilliant. Here we go. Introjection is an assimilation of object to subject. Projection is a dissimulation of object from subject through the expulsion of subjective content into the object. You find it? Yeah, Jung does not write very nice. Nevertheless, I just want to put what Jung wrote about this topic.
Is that what Michael Ford picked up on with his, like, when the energy goes out and then back in his developmental period?
I cannot recall right now, but I think you're right. You're talking about the child.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have his remarks right now. I will talk about Neumann because exactly from the child, there's a passage that I think is extremely important in this context we are presenting. Okay, but coming there. So, how it works. When you look on the external world, what we have? We have a tree, we have a woman and a guy, we have buildings, we have animals. What we look outside, I'm having this image of you right now, group here attending, hopefully paying attention to what I'm trying to say, and the chair and the technique and all the things around. I'm seeing the world outside, the external world. And then I have my inner world with all these structures that we mentioned, the conscious, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, the based on the archetypes and so on. I have my ego, my whole personality in the center, and I do have my complexes. And when I look outside, what happens? I see you and project unconsciously part of my own psyche in what I see. And from what comes from you comes into my psyche. And this is the process we are talking about. If I get into my psyche, it needs to have a value, an emotion connected with that. If I put onto you something, it's because I put something from my own values and emotions onto you, and so on and so forth. This is a circular process. And these interactions are based on the functional structure of the psyche. This will be a Jungian model of what we are talking about. Okay? The shadow and the ego. What happens then? The things that I don't like, the incompatible or repressed elements, I put there outside. In the sky, this woman. And then I deal with my inner world outside in this confrontation. By the way, this projection requires a hook. I do not project onto someone without reason. Sometimes there is a hook on the other to hang my projections on. Okay? And this is what becomes this whole thing pretty much complicated. But that's the way it works, according to the traditional Jungian view of shadow. So far, so good?
I have,
Sure.
Why does it say only incompatible contents? It can be compatible also.
It could be positive things too.
I mean, love, you need projection to fall in love and to get into a relationship. And it is not necessarily a bad thing or an incompatible thing. Projections.
What I'm talking about is projection based on the shadow.
That could be anima and
Isn't it always the case?
Well, if you're projecting your anima or animus in someone, then you're going to have a wonderful time with your projections. Particularly if it's the introjection is also positive. If what comes from outside is also nice, you have a perfect partner. Or at least for a while the projections are working. When the projections come down, then you're going to see the person how he or she could be or really is. And then maybe it becomes love and not projection. Right? Here we go. An interesting concept, talking to Neumann, that he presents in The Child. I think it's a very necessary thing to understand in this context is the following. He writes, the vocation of an archetype and the related release of a latent psychic development are not only intrapsychic processes. When an archetype is activated, it's not just something happen in me, inside my psyche. He writes, they take place in an archetypal field which embraces inside and outside. It is a relationship when an archetype is activated, and which always includes and presupposes an outside stimulus, a world factor. In other words, I need to have something outside that activates a structure in me. And this interrelationship between inside and outside that makes the thing work. It's okay? Yes?
Falling in love is projection. What is loving?
Well, better would be a poet to answer this question. But I would say the following. Project. There is some neurosciences research on this way. We do not see the person. We just see the nice thing the other does. So the beautiful eyes, the wonderful smell, oh, her perfume. Wow. Oh, he looked like, oh, Brad Pitt, oh, in front of me. Wow, yes. Oh, he's so nice. He's so kind. And interesting enough, if the other one is also in love with you, he will try to fit in your expectations as you will going to try to fit in his. This kind of combining projection and introjection, I want to see and to be seen like this. With the time, with everyday life, goes down. You can talk about the oxytocin, adrenaline, and all this stuff working. But once it comes down, well, maybe this Brad Pitt has a little bit of a big belly. You see, or something like, and you start to see small thing. Oh, okay, he doesn't behave the way I thought he would. He's not that generous I thought, and so on and so forth. Then you become to see the other as a totality, or as close of that. When it comes down, and you can accept the things, love will be then what remains after the projections are gone, because then you need to deal with the whole of the personality of the other. And if it's good enough, and there is a relationship that feeds this kind of connection, if there is a kind of acceptance, even though the other does not, is the Prince Charming, then we can talk about something more stable. Then this kind of oxytocin level is reached. I think that that's this neurotransmitter thing. And then you see it's another level. When we are in love, everything works perfectly. But after falling in love, when falling in love falls down.
So when I'm in reality and I'm no longer projecting, I am, what is the word? In the same, you know.
What is the work or words?
The word.
Word.
It's object relationship.
Then will be a real relationship and not based in a, I will not call it a necessary projection as an illusion, but there is a part of illusion in a projection too. Then the world is more real. Then the relationship is really in a level that I do not see just my ideal onto the other, but I see how he or she really is. Yes?
In your estimation, how much is just pure physical attraction owed to projection? Like pure
Attraction is such a big world. It's such a big word too. You see, there is physical attraction, of course, but I would tell you an answer that I got from a friend of mine when I was still in university. She told me, women are attracted, but mostly by what they hear, and men by what they see. I will not say that it's completely right, but I will not say that it's completely wrong. If a Brad Pitt comes and said the right things, brilliant. But if he said the stupid things, attraction may be gone.
How much of what you see or hear is projection and how much not?
Oh, this is a pretty much hard work in order to differentiate. You see, this element happens also in not pathological thing. In everyday life, we are doing projection.
Yeah.
And this kind of thing, once we start to relate, it depends on the importance of it, depends on the intensity of the emotion related to this, or your life story, who develops this or that complex, and so on and so forth. There is such a huge amount of possibilities here. And I will not say that we are projecting all the time, but one hint would be when the intensity of the emotion is higher, it could be a complex behind it. This is the main of the word association experiment of Jung. When the complex is hit, there was lots of marks on that showing the time was longer, the connection was strange, or the explanation was whatever. So when you hit a complex, then there is some kind of emotion behind it, of indication that there is something more than just a word association. Good. I get slowly in trouble. So the shadow, back. Collected Works 9, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. That's what we're talking about when we need to confront ourselves in this level. And I'm not talking about I don't like ice cream. You see, it's not a small thing. There is when it really challenges you. To become conscious of it involves, point important, recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. You see, I underline, recognize the dark side aspects of the personality as present, as real, because it's really a challenge. Oh, I'm going today to confront my shadow. Forget about it, doesn't work like that. Closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly, an obsessive or better possessive quality. It takes control of you. Okay? Effects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time, they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. I'm going to show where, this is just the paragraphs, where it is, will come later. Then shadow and projections. Again, Jung, the resistance are usually bound up with projections, which are not recognized as such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. As we know, it's not the conscious subject of the unconscious which does the projecting. Hence, one meets the projection with projections, one does not make it. So it's not a conscious choice making projection. It happens to you. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment. This is so much important. Since instead of a real relationship to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projection changed the world into the replica of one's unknown face. The worst case of this is, of course, paranoia. Everything outside wants to hurt you, to harm you. And I don't know about you who have this experience, it's extremely difficult to change that, if possible, at all. Almost done with these elements, with the shadow. It's under all circumstances an advantage, however, to be in full possession of one's personality, to know oneself. Otherwise, the repressed elements will only crop up as a hindrance elsewhere. This is what you mentioned before. Whereas projection have to know it. Not just as someone, not at some important point, but at the very spot where it's most sensitive. If people can be educated to see the shadow side of their nature clearly, it may be hoped that they will also learn to understand and love their fellow man better. A little less hypocrisy and a little more self-knowledge all have good results in respect for our neighbor. For we are all too prone to transfer to our fellows the injustice and violence we inflict upon our own natures. Baum. Self-knowledge for Jung. Self-observation, relating to oneself, accepting oneself with these bad things in me. Becoming aware of become conscious of our projections. This is a very hard thing to be done. To complete, no matter what obstacle we came up against, provide only if there's a difficult one, the discord between our own purpose and the refractory object soon becomes a discord in ourselves when it's not integrated. For a while, I'm striving to subordinate the object to my will. My whole being is gradually brought into relationship with it, following the strong libido investment, which, as it were, draws a portion of my being across into the object. The result of this is a partially identification of certain portions of my personality with similar qualities in the object. This is pretty much important to what comes next. As soon as the identification has taken place, the conflict is transferred into my own psyche. This introjection of the conflict with the object creates an inner discord, making me powerless against the object and also reflect the releasing affects, which are always symptomatic in inner disharmony. Okay, now the shadow as an inner aggressor, okay? The constellation that we have, please keep in mind these concepts that are presented till now, is the following. Incompatible and repressed elements of someone is projected upon a child. And this happens very often. You are stupid. You are aggressive. Projected identification, remember? You cannot do it. You're just a burden for me. Again and again and again. I cannot cope with these issues. I do not see that it's part of me. I see them outside, in the weakest part. The mechanism presents in this movement is the projection of the shadow in this aggressor, the projective identification behavior of the aggressor. I lead this one to behave as I expected them to behave, and the introjection in the child. This is the mechanism that we are talking about. Okay? What we have then is that concerning Neumann's world factor, an education based on aggression, humiliation, accusations will heat the ego, this world factor from outside. It will affect massively self-esteem, self-image. And what is incompatible what I cannot assimilate, and the repressed things, I don't like it, goes into the shadow. What happens then that the shadow identifies in a child with the essence of the object, introjection of the negative projection, and the affective symptoms of an inner discord, to return to Jung's remarks. What we have then is that the shadow begins to attack the ego. You are stupid, coming from inside. And it also makes a difference if there is a you are in the first person, or someone else telling you inside your mind you are bad. The ego identification of that is stronger when you call in the first person, I am stupid, for instance. So what we have, what are the consequences of this movement, of this constellation? First, in this child, massive negative experience with authority figures in a dependent relationship, father, mother, teacher, etc., during the development of the personality. This is the basic constellation we are talking about. Introjection and the inability to differentiate psychically the negative projections from outside. A child cannot do that. He can rebel against it sometimes, but he cannot differentiate in this level. The child is unable to differentiate the negative world factor, Neumann's, from the properties felt as negative within himself. If I say to a child, you are aggressive, the child has his, her own aggression. Well, I'm feeling that too. And then there is a mix between what was projected onto me with my own stuff. The negative evaluated characteristics such as aggression, anger, behavior associated with shame, or behaviors not accepted in education, etc., are repressed, suppressed, put down, and become part of the shadow. The psychic structures that act in the formation of the shadow, which would normally project this element, turns then mainly against the own ego. That is the characteristics we are talking about. Okay? The results may be shadow with an aggressive attitude against the ego. This is this massive inner critic. And it's really torturing, like the demons in the Middle Ages. Fear of abandonment and excessive demands on oneself. Sometimes it develops into a borderline personality, for instance, or depression. Feeling of guilt, absolutely present in this sense. I did something wrong. It's my fault. Massive problems with self-esteem and self-image. One does not see oneself. He sees this mirror, that's this world factor, show up to him or her. Okay. Still have 15 minutes. I need to run, but I think we made it. Okay. Oh, no, we don't. Sorry. I'm going to jump to what can be done, okay? And go a little bit fast, otherwise we don't make it. We're not going to make it, okay? So, what can be done? This fairy tale it was included in this book that I mentioned at the beginning. I think it's nice because this guy is not a Jungian theorist, but he wrote about the fairy tale. And I think this is really, really a nice thing because it fits. And this is the Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who said every day, oh, if only I had a child, for they did not. Then it happened when the queen was passing, a frog came out of the water on the land and said to her, your wish will come true before 1 year passes. You will give birth to a daughter. What the frog had said come true, and the queen gave birth to a baby girl who was so beautiful that the king could not help rejoicing and make a great feast. He invited not only his relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but also 12 fairies that they may be kind and supportive with the child. But there were 13 fairies in the kingdom, and as he had only 12 golden plates to serve them, one of them was not invited. The feast was celebrated with all splendor, and when it was over, the fairies presented the child with their gifts. One with virtue, the other with beauty, the third with wealth, and that's desired in the world. When the 11th has finished giving her gifts, the 13th suddenly entered. She wanted revenge for not having been invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she shouted aloud, "The king's daughter shall prick her finger on a weaving spindle in her 15th year and fall down dead." And without saying another word, she turned and left the hall. Everyone was frightened, but the 12th fairy, who still had her gift to be given, had no way to cancel this spell, but could only lessen it. She said, "It will not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years into which the king's daughter will fall." Evil uninvited takes its revenge. This is the very important message of this fairy tale. You cannot undo the course, but maybe it can be mitigated. The path treatment is to activate the positive resource that still exists and work on the new inner relationship. Hopefully one can achieve an attention of the evil that was done, attenuation of the evil that was done. And perhaps by finding love, awakening what was unconscious. Love to oneself. Okay? So far the fairy tale. Taking the fairy tale as a hint, what can we do as therapists, as analysts in our practice? That's what I'm going to present now. Oh, sorry. Before the old guide again. We psychologists have learned through long and painful experience that deprive a man of his best resource when you help him to get rid of his complexes. You can not only help him to become sufficiently aware of them and to start a conscious conflict within himself. In this way, the complex becomes a focus of life. Anything that disappears from your psychological inventory is up to turn up into the guise of a hostile neighbor who will inevitably arouse you anger and makes you aggressive. It's surely better to know that your worst enemy is right there in your own heart. So, far from Jung. What can we do? First part, using logos will mean the rational side. Okay, I'm talking about cases now. What we can do in our practical work. One element will be using logos, the rational side. Questioning, identifying, and understanding what one has learned about oneself. Differentiate what came from the projection of the external critic. This is a very hard and necessary step. I need to differentiate what belongs to me and what not. And for that, we need differentiating. How we do this? Who said this thing to you? What was said? How what is said? What? Why was it said? It's true or not? Using the rational side when we are beginning to deal with this complex, with this evil, is somehow differentiating in a first step, in a rational way, what had happened. What was said? Who said? Why? The aim is to understand and become aware of the external critic's message. Basically, differentiation. Again, we do need, as you mentioned, how to identify projection. It's very important, it's self-observation. What belongs to me, what not? Where I have learned this? And from whom? When we do this first step, we do this step of differentiation in a conscionable, rational way. What happened to me? So far, so good. But the rational side is not enough, by far not enough. It's one necessary step, but not the only one. Using imagination, this will be a second thing. The work with the inner images becomes extremely important. The inner critic, there are various techniques of guided imagination. We can work on that. One example, personification of our inner critic in an imaginative figure. And then have a dialogue with that. We are talking a basic process of guided imagination related to the active imagination. The main difference is guided imagination, you are much more active, you guide more. I will give you an example at the end of this kind of personification. You identify an evil figure and create an inner image that represents it and starts to dialogue with it. Why it's helpful? Then the ego sees something outside this main position. I can relate to something that's not me, it's part of me, but it's not my I. And through this personification, I begin to have a dialogue with that. It's a further step of differentiation, but here with not logical, but with imaginative techniques. The goal is to differentiate the ego, the introjected, and the shadow, the unaccepted characteristics. You see, we are talking about a further differentiation. What belongs to me, what not? I have the right to be angry. And this kind of dialogue with inner figures is a really typical Jungian thing. Okay? Further, what really belongs to me and what not? And this is differentiation, the inner critic from this shadow itself. Because I do have a shadow too that belongs to me, and not that I swallowed it up. That means you learn to know the critic and yourself. And then the dialogue with inner figures that I just mentioned. Using transference and the counter-transference. This is the third necessary step in order to deal with that. Why is that important? You, as a therapist, and the relationship with you will be on a huge importance here, because this is a valuable relationship that can be different than the relationship this person had before. The person will project onto you, including a healer. You will help him or her. And this inner healer projected will be a positive thing and will be present in this movement. So once we are using transference and counter-transference, we are acting like the good fairy. Let's try to mitigate this evil. The aim is to develop a positive therapeutic relationship in which the therapist becomes supportive as an alter ego, another ego beside the ego of the client, helper in structuring negative experiences. This is such an important task with this kind of, actually with every client, but particularly with this one. Tolerating, differentiating, and integrating feelings like aggressor, anger, and the other negative projections within the therapeutic relationship against the fear of being abandoned. Transforming relationships and the encounter with the other. This could be the result. Once I can deal better with the things inside, I will have resources to transform the relationship outside. This is the goal. Okay? 7 minutes. Yes.
Sorry, I know you're. It's quite important. It's an actual case.
Yeah.
A woman that is coming to me. She had in 2019 a psychotic episode.
Okay. Just a remark. Really not identification things. You know that. I mean, we cannot. Okay. The privacy reasons. Yes.
Of course, but the thing is that she had a sort of a relapse. Like psychotic elements, and she said, like the wording she used the last meeting we had was something told her that like I think it's along the lines what you're describing here, that she's not actually good, and it was like a voice that told her they will try to convince you you're one of them, and by that she meant me, because there is obviously a projection going on as a white figure or a fairy godmother or something, but it was like, don't trust that, you're actually evil. And there goes the psychotic element, you know, with the active imagination and everything. And I mean, it's about the trust, but like, is there anything that you can think of what could help her? Because it was like, I mean, there's nothing, like, there's also a whole belief system she has. She's very spiritual and everything. Like, there's that trust and validation she needs that you cannot 100% like provide in that moment.
It's a very short and very, let's say, resume words. Then you see the importance of the ego. If the ego is identified with that, it's a much more harder work. First, point one. Concerning technique, first, look at this inner voice as something different than the ego. So if she could give this voice an image, what it would be? A lion, a tiger, a witch, whatever. And then listen to this witch, let's call. What is the witch saying? Do not trust her. And then helping this client to talk with the inner figure of the witch, whatever. Why should I not trust? What could be better? Can you help me, asking the witch, in order that could be better? You start to relate with the inner figure in a way that it becomes something away from the ego and at the same time relating to the ego. And then further, ask for, this is what will come next, positive experiences where she could trust. In other words, neurosciences, you activate a positive neuronal network. When someone is inside a complex, everything that comes close to this complex will be devoured by this emotion. We need to open up a door, a way, a highway that can lead to a new kind of feeling. And this is working with emotions, what becomes next. So you gave the chance that this person activate another feeling instead of mistrust, maybe of trust, maybe of support, that she really had in her life. And once you open this possibility, the evil voice is not the only one inside her psyche. Does it make sense? So it's a very, you see, I'm just resuming to the very specific, it's much more detailed than this, and it's much more important to know the case in itself. It's always a personal thing, the constellation. But once we find a door to open in this way, hopefully we'll be mitigating this negative influence. Okay? So, 3 minutes. Using the feeling, that means that means working on and with emotions, searching and calling the attention on positive ego experiences, past and present, what I just said, okay? Realizing and activating structural feelings such as compassion, joy, courage, success, anchoring positive memories, reinforcing the self-image. What does it mean? Go after positive experiences and work on imagination on that. Bring this image to that moment where the person is there suffering. Then it will not be just in this neuronal way of negative experiences. If you activate, this is the good fairy, you see, if you activate in your work this positive experience she or he had, he will be able to access a different emotion that the complex is telling him or her the way. Believe me, it's not simple, it's not easy, not at all, but it's a possible way to help this kind of person. Supporting self-acceptance and respect toward oneself. When he or she says something that, but I did it good, brilliant. You see, you are the good fairy. Show her you have this gift. Show him. Trust in yourself. When there is a real experience, that is the basic point, a real experience where feelings were touched in a positive way, these are supporting things. Reminding him or her that he's not just what the complex is telling. Okay? The aim is to evoke resources and strengthening self-esteem. You cannot go transforming complexes without touching emotions. Remember that. For example, guided imagination, embracing the inner child. For instance, imagine that the situation where the child was left in a very bad situation. We do not have time to go deep in this, but is this a possible way to work with imagination where you accept and you support this inner child that was hurt in that particular moment? Go there in your imagination and embrace it. But also recognizing, and this is also important, when the person is reacting with expectation of the inner child, that means immature. But I wanted that so much. Wait, now you're acting this way like a child. A child can expect, for instance, everyone will love me, but that's not real. When the immature vision of the world is there, we should also show that this could be part of the shadow too. There on shadow, I mean, not this introjected element. And then developing practice skills of action reaction. That means abandon the role of victim. A positive use of aggression that will mean assertiveness. So the inner critic could hopefully be transformed in a Socratic daimon, inviting the 13th fairy to this feast. This is the ideal condition. So I would give case examples, but we do not have time for that. It was just 2 elements of. Just want to remind, it was a client who has a really extremely bad, really bad, from abuse, from hunger, from living in the streets, every bad experience you had. With time in the trance, she could see me as a kind of inner voice, nota bene. I became introjected. And many times when she was being attacked, she listened to myself in her head shoulder saying, you could react differently. I became an angel's voice in her shoulder who's supporting her. I became part of her psychic structure. She was starting to listen to a part of her inner healer projected onto me, because the relationship was supportive enough to have a new relationship with oneself. We do not have time, unfortunately, to go deeper in this example, but just to show you, it really can be helpful, but it will not be something that will completely go away. You can mitigate this evil, inviting the 13th fair. But for those who suffer under this is really a great help. Thank you, guys.